What's going on, guys? Alex here, walking through a rather deserted park on a colder day. People have started to avoid public spaces, I guess, as much as they used to when the sun was out. I wanted to talk on disappointment today. Just a couple of points on it for any of you guys who are going through disappointment. And if you're not, then you might have to pinch yourself because you might not be human, right? We all go through disappointment, and actually, and this is going to be one of my points, the more disappointment we experience, the more of a realization, I suppose, you can have that we're actually living, which is a good thing. You know, we're living and we're actually entering the ring. We're not sitting on the sidelines. The more disappointment we experience in our lives is a good sign, a good indication that we're doing stuff and we're making stuff happen. So I wanted to just speak on one point, because obviously the oft repeated insight and solutions that people tend to share when talking about disappointment are, you know, how can you turn it into a positive, right? And it's almost done to death these days. You know, you come across a challenge in your life, come across a disappointment, how can you turn it round and turn it into a good thing? How can you find a way to shift your perspective and turn it into a positive? That's great, and I think that's probably one of the best ways you can approach disappointment. But I wanted to just discuss perhaps a kind of peripheral idea associated with the idea of disappointment that might be helpful as well, which is just allow my cogs in my brain to remember what it was as we reflect upon this beautiful sight. So when you're disappointed, I want us all to think about, and by the way, keep getting disappointed, because that's how things are going to happen for you. You can't move through life, you can't create momentum without disappointments. It's inevitable. But we've already discussed that, that's already covered. I want you to think about the idea of disappointment. What does it mean? Really shift along and maybe take a fresh perspective of disappointment. Maybe see disappointment as though you've just entered reality for the first time. Maybe, you know, it sounds a bit weird, but you're like a newborn. I always find that when you take on the attitude, take on the imaginary attitude of someone who's never experienced reality, how might they see something like disappointment or any other negative experience? Well, disappointment, if you think about it, is something that is molded and crafted in our minds, in our thinking as we live through life. It's crafted through the help of friends and family. It's crafted through the help of movies that we watch that are about disappointment and rejection. And the more we kind of buy into the idea that disappointment is a thing, it certainly feels like a thing, right? Feel the pain of not having things go your way. It feels like a very real thing. But all of this is something that's molded. The idea in itself is something that is molded and crafted as you live through life and you experience more and more things. But the emphasis here is on idea. Disappointment is, like so many of the other things I discuss, and many of those ideas might be putting many of you off because it sounds too airy-fairy and too simplistic and too spiritual. But disappointment is an illusion. It isn't a real thing. It's only a thing because we've given credence to it as an idea thanks to our clever imaginary capacity. So I'm sure, and this is the kind of example that tends to help and tends to relieve the idea and bring a whole new perspective on the idea, is think back in your life when you thought you experienced a disappointment. Somebody said no to your offering of a date or a service. Can't really think of any other ideas at the moment. But think of a moment in your past when you were disappointed and you just didn't like what was going on. Maybe you were denied a toy when you were young, or maybe you were denied a chocolate bar, or maybe your parents were very strict around something in your life that you weren't allowed access to, that you at the time were very disappointed by. But then maybe a few years pass and you look back and you're like, I'm so glad they did that. I'm so glad they didn't give me too much money, pocket money, when I was growing up, because I'd become too entitled. And I'm so glad I went through that lack, that sense of lack in a way, because it gave me such an increased, expanded sense of gratitude. And it, in a sense, motivated me and encouraged me to be the person I am today. So hang on a sec, weren't you disappointed? Didn't you create a sense of disappointment at some point in your life? Weren't you deeply pained by the disappointment? And then a few years later, realized that it wasn't even a disappointment, it was a blessing. And with that blessing, with that sense of blessing in your mind, you feel the relief and the joy around that. So it's an entirely different emotional experience based on the same event. The same thing happened. Nothing changed in your past, and yet your recollection of the event has changed. Your experience of the event has changed from pain to relief. Oh gosh, there's nowhere I can sit. It's a bit wet. So that's really the emphasis for this video, is, disappointment, just like many of the other ideas we hold in our heads, is something that looks real, feels tangible, feels painful, looks like a real thing, is not necessarily a real thing. I mean, it isn't a real thing. It is a illusion. An illusion is something that we create in our minds that looks real but isn't, because it's essentially a figment of our imagination. It is a lie that we've told ourselves. A lie is just a thought with a pile of judgment attached to it. So when you next find yourself disappointed, I want you, perhaps less so to try and think of clever ways to turn it around and turn it into a success. That's one thing. That can be very helpful. But maybe you're going through a disappointment right now. I want you to take a look at the thought that you're holding in your head right now and see it for what it is. Don't overanalyze the situation and the event and try and kind of replay videos in your mind of what happened and how I could have done things better. That's all just heaviness, that's all pressure. Instead of that, just take a look at the thought and take a look at it in a meditative, mindful sense, and look at what's going on in your mind and see it for what it is. It's just literally a thought. You have conjured an image, you have conjured a sensation in your body and in your mind that says this is bad, that says that things are not going right in my life. And just by seeing it for what it is, bringing a kind of very, in a sense, this is a very rational way of seeing the world. A lot of us are experiencing a lot of pain out there because we're irrational beings. And what does irrational mean? It means that we're believing in a thought that isn't true. This applies to everything. So bring rationality into your life. As soon as you bring rationality by understanding how thinking works and by taking a look at the reality of thought, that is rationality. That's being, in a sense, it's kind of like logical, but it's looking at the purity of truth. The more of that you can do, the more relief you're going to experience, and the more insight and wisdom is going to come to the fore in the space that you've created in your mind. Your mind is no longer obsessing about all the little details of what happened, because you're looking at the real truth. You're looking at things as they are. When you can see things for what they are, your mind, your thoughts will tend to still, and that's where real creativity will come through. So you don't even need to try hard to come up with a creative next act, which is going to be inevitable when you look at disappointment for what it is. Hope that helped, guys. Do subscribe if you like this video. Make sure you like the video as well, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.